Vice President Kamala Harris laid down the law for Israel this weekend, and actually much of the world is now unified in their idea of how Israel should end the war with Hamas. I'll have information on all of those things coming up on In Focus. U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris, I guess, is playing the role of the bad cop for the Biden administrations against John Kirby, the National Security Council's spokesperson, who's playing the good cop. Anyway, in her bad cop role, Vice President Kamala Harris was attending a climate change summit in the UAE over the weekend, and she made a series of statements about what she thinks of Israel's war against Hamas in Gaza that are actually quite important and significant.
5 principles guide our approach for post-conflict Gaza. No forcible displacement, no reoccupation, no siege or blockade, no reduction in territory, and no use of Gaza as a platform for terrorism. We want to see a unified Gaza and West Bank under the Palestinian Authority, and Palestinian voices and aspirations must be at the center of this work. President Biden and I have also been clear with the Israeli government in public and in private many times. As Israel defends itself, it matters how. The United States is unequivocal. International humanitarian law must be respected. Too many innocent Palestinians have been killed. Frankly, the scale of civilian suffering and the images and videos coming from Gaza are devastating. I have spoken with members of the Palestinian, Arab, and Muslim communities of America, including those who have lost loved ones in Gaza and American citizens who were injured and evacuated from Gaza. It is truly heartbreaking. As Israel pursues its military objectives in Gaza, we believe Israel must do more to protect innocent civilians.
Here's a problem. If you don't want anybody to leave, then it's very difficult to prevent anybody from getting killed in the war because A, Gaza is very crowded and small, and B, Hamas's war doctrine is to fight behind civilians, okay? So if you don't want civilians to be hurt, then the people that you have to be pointing a finger at are from Hamas. And that's not what's happening. Instead of pointing a finger at Hamas and saying, hey, Israel, use all due hates to prosecute the war and let's help you finish off Hamas so that we can protect the people of Gaza, they're saying, Israel, you can't fight Hamas because this is Hamas's doctrine. And by the way, Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, who was here at the end of the last week, made statements very, very similar to Kamala Harris. So let's just be clear. This is the overriding view of the Biden administration, not just one view among many. This is the position, this is the policy, this is also the policy that President Biden has put out. It's just that Kamala said it so well and clearly that I thought she was the one that we should really be talking about here. So there are 2 problems with the ideas, 2 more problems that I want to point out about this. The one is that there's this concept of innocent civilians in war zones that is a little bit more difficult to get our arms around when it comes to the Palestinians in Gaza. And, it's not just that the vast majority of Palestinians in Gaza and, of course, in Judea and Samaria, we've spoken about the numbers already several times on this show, are overwhelmingly supportive of Hamas. They're mobilized on behalf of Hamas's war aim of destroying Israel, of annihilating the Jewish people, if possible, as sadistically and brutally as possible. It's not just that thousands of civilians in Gaza actually invaded Israel after the initial Hamas push into Israeli territory and participated in the murder, the rape, the theft of Israeli property and the kidnapping of Israeli civilians to Gaza from from their communities inside of Israel, from the Nova Music Festival along the border with Gaza. It's not just that thousands of innocent civilians from Gaza participated in the actual war crimes that Hamas perpetrated on October 7th. It's also that they continued to do so. And here I just want to show you a video that came out on a Hamas Telegram page this past week. You see that there is a group of people in Gaza who are running in the streets after apparently or under an Israeli Air Force bombardment. And you see here are two men that are holding on to a woman. They're trying to force her to cover her face. So the woman does not look like a Gazan. She looks like an Israeli. And when that video initially surfaced last week, people started saying, wait a minute, who is that woman? Is she one of the hostages? And as it works out that, yes, indeed, she is a hostage. Her name is Inbar Hyman, and she was kidnapped from the Nova Music Festival on October 7th. And she is being held, as we see in Gaza, by at least one of those people is a civilian. So she is being held by Gazans. So is that man who's holding this poor innocent woman a hostage, doing God only knows what with her? Is he an innocent civilian? No, he is not an innocent civilian. And of course, we saw last week, while the hostages were being released, we found out that one of them, at least, was being held by an UNRWA teacher in his house, in his attic, right? He has like 10 kids or something downstairs, but upstairs in the attic, he was starving an Israeli civilian to death, who he was holding hostage, okay? And I don't think I mentioned, but that the hospital officials in Israel were saying on average, the children who were released from captivity in Gaza through the hostage deal, hostage for terrorists and ceasefire deal that Israel made with the devil that is Hamas, on average, the children who were being held in Gaza lost 15% of their body weight. And what the physicians explained was that on the most severe diets that are given to children, children are expected to lose up to 10% of their body weight, so that the children who were being held hostage in Gaza were being starved, quite simply. So here's this UNRWA guy, right, innocent civilian and a UN employee who has to be protected, who is holding a hostage. And he wasn't the only one. We also had the report that a doctor in Gaza, a pediatrician, is taking care of children in his practice and holding Israeli children, Israeli Jewish children hostage in his home, okay? So these are not innocent civilians. These are full participants in Hamas's crimes against humanity that it's perpetrating through the continued holding of kidnapping and holding of Israeli hostages and their torture and their murder, as we've seen in many cases. So that's about the innocent civilians. The other thing that we have to realize, again, is, as I said, you can't protect these people to the extent that they are innocent inside of Gaza. It's too crowded. So there's only one solution, just as there is only one solution in almost every war zone that anybody knows, which is to remove the civilian populations from the war zone. Again, we've spoken about this. Israel has removed over 100,000 Israelis from the border communities with Gaza and from the border communities with Lebanon in order to protect them. So we have over 100,000 internal refugees in Israel that we resettled to get them out of the war zone. Okay, if you go down to Eilat, today, this week, we start celebrating Hanukkah. Normal times, my family goes down to Hanukkah almost every year. That's our tradition to celebrate. We go down to Eilat, but Eilat today is basically a refugee camp. All of the hotels are filled with residents from the south who have been relocated from their communities, many of which have been destroyed, to the hotels in Eilat in order to protect them, to remove them from the war zone. Okay, so now you have these people in Gaza, and Kamala Harris said, under no circumstances will the United States permit the forced relocation of Palestinians from Gaza and the West Bank, the besiegement of Gaza, or the redrawing of the borders of Gaza. So I think some of those things, it's a jumbled sentence, but I think she's talking about some of the things are after the war and some of the things are during the war. So the forced relocation, is it forced if they want to leave? They want to leave, right? They want to get out of the war zone. They're not allowed to, so they're not actually being forcibly relocated. They're forcibly being forced to remain. But the idea that they would leave under the current sort of international climate, I think it's fairly clear that any relocation of the Gazans during the course of the war would be considered forced, right? Because they would say, well, they're only leaving because Israel is bombing. But Israel is bombing because Hamas went to war against Israel, and Israel is now returning war for war, right? So what they're really saying is that a relocation of Gazans in times of war would be forced. And that means that Israel would be responsible for a forcible relocation, even though, of course, Hamas is responsible for the forcible relocation of over 100,000 Israelis, but nobody talks about that. That's taken for granted. But if Gazans leave, and here's the other thing that's so appalling about this, is that in every war zone that you can look at, millions of people leave the war zones. They go to third countries either for the duration of the war or they permanently resettle in those areas as a result of their displacement in times of war. For instance, you have 6 million Syrians who have left Syria, in the last decade during the war inside of Syria. They're in Iraq, they're in Jordan, they're in Turkey, and of course in 2015, over 1 million of them were resettled in Europe, right? So nobody is expecting those Syrians, by the way, to go back to Syria. All of them are expected, right, by the international community, such as it is, to provide them with permanent homes in these countries that they sought refuge from the wars inside of. Okay, it's only Gazans that are not Palestinians that are not allowed to leave, that are not allowed to be resettled anywhere. And here I just want to turn from Kamala for a second to a man named Philippe Lazzarini. So who is Philippe Lazzarini? He is the director of UNRWA. And here I think I'll talk about it in a second, but why UNRWA is specifically responsible for everything that's happening in Gaza today and really everything that has happened to the Palestinians for the past 75 years, even before they referred to themselves as Palestinians. So UNRWA is the UN Relief Works Association for Palestinians. Okay, so what it is it is a separate agency inside of the UN system that is dedicated solely to Palestinians. Palestinian refugees are all handled by UNRWA, whereas all refugees from every other country, Syria, Ukraine, anywhere. Ukraine, by the way, I think 5 or 6 million Ukrainians, 12 million Ukrainians have left the country since the Russian invasion last year. Okay, so you have 12 million Ukrainians left. Nobody thinks that that's weird. Nobody opposed under any circumstances the relocation of Ukrainians from Ukraine. But here, the official policy laid out by the U.S. government, by the vice president, is that the United States will not permit, right, the relocation of Palestinians from Gaza or from the West Bank. Okay, so every other refugee population in the world is handled under the UN system by the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. And the job of the UNHCR is to resettle people who are forced to leave war zones into third countries. That's their job, is to permanently resettle these refugees. If they're able to go home at some later date, fine. But that's not the job of the UNHCR. The UNHCR's job is to protect them when they're in displaced persons camps, set them up, and then seek their resettlement in third countries. Okay, but 75 years ago, the UN set up a separate refugee agency that did two things that were unbelievable. The first thing is they blocked resettlement of Palestinians, of Arabs who left the state of Israel during the pan-Arab invasion of Israel in 1947-48, which was actually spearheaded by the local Arabs who sought to annihilate Israel already after the UN partition plan was passed in the UN General Assembly on November 29th, 1947. So they opened the war on November 30th, 1947, and then they were joined the day that Israel declared independence on May 15th, 1948, by 5 invading Arab armies. And during the course, first of the first stage of that war, and second, in the second stage of that war, so the Palestinian Arabs who left Israel and they moved to surrounding Arab countries, they were not handled by the UNHCR. They were handled by this new UN organization that was made just for them, UNRWA. They were placed in camps, so that started out very similar, say, to the Jewish refugees after World War II that were placed in displaced persons camps in places like France. But then they weren't allowed to resettle anywhere. They were left in camps. The second thing that's different is that whereas, say, if your grandparent was a refugee in World War II or in Ukraine, and you were born outside of that country, you are not considered a refugee. Only your forefathers are. So it's not hereditary. Just because your parent was a refugee of the India-Pakistan wars and left the area to be resettled in a different country, this child of that refugee, or certainly the grandchild or the great-grandchild of that refugee, is considered to be a permanent resident or a citizen of the countries that they were born in. That occurs for everybody except for the descendants of the Palestinian Arabs who left the state of Israel in 1948, 1949. They were granted or required to maintain perpetual refugee status. So they're not allowed to be resettled, and their children are also not allowed to be resettled. We are now in the 5th generation of Palestinian refugees from 1948-49, and you have a UN agency that was set up back then in order to prevent them from ever being resettled at any time ever in human history. 100 generations will pass and they will still be refugees, and they still will be denied the right to resettle in third countries and receive citizenship by the UN system, because UNRWA is there to perpetuate their misery. Okay? So that is why this can't be solved, because the UN has a whole agency dedicated to blocking the solution to the refugee problem from 1948-49. Just to be clear, there were about 700,000 Arabs who left the nascent state of Israel in 1948-49. There was an equal number of Jews who were pushed out of their ancestral communities in places like Iraq and Morocco and Yemen and Egypt and Lebanon and Syria, and they came to Israel as refugees. They were all resettled as Israeli citizens. But it doesn't matter. The Arabs who left the land of Israel, not allowed to be resettled because the UN wanted to perpetuate their war against Israel eternally, forever. And that's what happened. And now we see that the United States supports this goal by blocking the resettlement. And what the funny things is that one of the Hamas leaders who was being interviewed by one of the Arab stations since October 7th said, you know, it's not our problem to protect the people of Gaza. 70% of those people are refugees, and therefore it's the UN's responsibility to protect them, not ours. It was an answer to a question of why didn't you ever build bomb shelters for the people of Gaza, whereas Hamas has all of the subterranean tunnels that protect its terrorists from Israeli aerial bombing. They never built one bomb shelter for the people of Gaza that everybody cares so much about, right, to protect them from the same bombing. And he said, because it's not our responsibility, it's the UN's responsibility because they're refugees. So what is happening is that there's no responsibility on the part of any Palestinian government, terrorist regime, non-terrorist regime, it doesn't matter. Everything is a responsibility of UNRWA, and UNRWA is responsible for keeping these people in a state of perpetual suffering in order to maintain them in a state of perpetual war against Israel. And the United States supports this goal, as Kamala Harris just said on Saturday. Under no circumstances will the United States permit the forced relocation of Palestinians from Gaza and the West Bank, the besiegement of Gaza, or the redrawing of the borders of Gaza. Okay? We'll get to the last clauses in that about the redrawing of the borders of Gaza, et cetera, in a second. But just to be clear, so the whole idea here is if you don't support the resettlement of these people, certainly during time of war, and what you're saying is that you don't want Israel to win, you want Hamas to win, and we'll get to that in a second. But Lazzarini had this really ironic line in this interview that he gave to The Guardian. So he goes on about the suffering and that they're all in UN facilities, et cetera, and he also threatened Israel with war crimes indictments for carrying out collective punishment by not protecting the human shields in its persecution of the war against Hamas, even though under international law, human shields are legitimate military targets, and the responsibility for civilian deaths in the case that people are being used as human shields is on the side of the people who are using them as civilian shields, and not on the part of the combatants that are attacking those combatants who are hiding behind them as human shields. But everything is contorted, and international law is put on its head when it comes to the Jews. So this is the ironic line that he said. The longer this war lasts and the more people die, there will be a very strong feeling in the region that international humanitarian law does not apply the same for everyone. Got that? That international humanitarian law does not apply the same for everyone. Why is this ironic? Because the UN system guarantees, right, that Palestinians will not receive the same right of resettlement as every other people on the face of the planet. So he's right. I mean, by design, international humanitarian law does not apply the same for everyone. Israel is required to enable the international community, the UN system, to perpetuate the Palestinian war for the annihilation of the Jewish state. We're supposed to facilitate the perpetuation of that war, right? And at the same time, if we don't do so, then we're going to be charged with war crimes that no other nation on the face of the earth would ever be charged with, because we're acting in full accord with international humanitarian law. So when the United States of America, when the Biden administration demands that Israel prosecute the war in accordance with international humanitarian law, what they're saying is the precise opposite of what they mean is the precise opposite of what they're saying. They're saying there's a singular standard only for Israel, which blocks you from ever being able to end the war in victory or end the war in anything other than your own self-destruction, right? And those are the laws that apply only to you, and we expect you to abide by those laws that guarantee your self-destruction if you abide by them. So that's what's happening with that. There's only one way for the civilians in Gaza to be protected, and that's to allow them to leave. So you have collusion between the UN, the United States, and Egypt to prevent that from happening in order to guarantee or to facilitate a Palestinian victory. And what's funny is that the headline of the article about Lazzarini, about the UNRWA chair, is, this is again The Guardian, Israeli assault on southern Gaza could push 1 million refugees to the UN border. Well, duh, right? And the answer of an international community that actually cared about the Palestinians, the innocent civilians in Gaza, would be to require Egypt to open the border to let them in order to prevent the humanitarian crisis that they're all bemoaning and saying Israel is causing. But it's actually they who are causing this civilian catastrophe, such as it is among the civilians in Gaza, because they're refusing to allow them to leave. Okay. Incidentally, no, I'll just leave it at that. But this goes to the second part that I wanted to talk about, which is that while they're attacking Israel and claiming that we're responsible for war crimes that they actually by design are committing and enabling Hamas to commit, everybody is all now agreed that the goal of this war, if already we're ensuring that tactically we're going to prevent Israel from winning by saying that it's not allowed to engage in any action that will actually succeed in defeating Hamas, which is hiding behind the civilian population in Gaza, which is the same civilian population that's actually mobilized on behalf of Hamas. They're also saying that we want our long game for Gaza is a total defeat of Israel on a strategic level and in perpetuity. So here we have, again, Vice President Kamala Harris. Yeah, she's very nice. She said she was speaking to Sisi, the president of Egypt, the man who said that he would consider going to war with Israel, actually, if Israel tried to force him to accept refugees from Gaza into the Sinai. And by the way, I would assume that also involves how he would feel if the Gazans left Gaza through Sinai on the way to a third country that they could resettle in, at least for the duration of the war, like, say, Turkey or Qatar, which both are state sponsors of Hamas, or Chechnya, I understand, said that they would take them. Ireland said that they would take them, although then they changed their mind, or Scotland did, when they realized that that might actually be something helpful. They don't want to do that. They want to perpetuate the conflict so that they can have a justification for hating Jews. But be that as it may, so Harris, good old Kamala, she said that the thing that has to guide all of the great statesmen who are engaging in the issue of Israel and Hamas, Israel and the Palestinians, is that the efforts to bring about, well, she said, ideas for post-conflict planning in Gaza. She was discussing them with Sisi, and they include efforts on reconstruction, security, and governance. Blah, blah, blah. Reconstruction, security, and governance. Whatever. You're talking about this jihadist society that just committed acts of genocide against the Jewish people on October 7th, but now we're talking about reconstructing them so that they're happy and giving them security so that they continue to carry out their genocide against Israel in peace and then have good governance while they do that so they get their trash picked up. Anyway, she said, she emphasized that these efforts can only succeed if they are pursued in the context of a clear political horizon for the Palestinian people towards a state of their own led by a revitalized Palestinian authority and have significant support from the international community and countries of the region. Now, I just love this. They have this new, like, you know that they just have these PR executives working with them on the copywriting for this, right? Because the new lingo, the new buzz term is revitalize Palestinian society. That's how they're relabeling this terrorist regime that's led by Fatah terrorists in the West Bank, in Judea and Samaria, right? I mean, like, this is a regime that is infused with genocidal ambitions, right? They carry out constant acts of war against Israel through terrorism, whether it's by sponsoring terrorism, financing terrorism, glorifying terrorism, and engaging in actual terrorist violence against Israel. Like, there's nothing in the Palestinian Authority that should give anybody any reason to think, right, that this is an authority that can be viewed as moderate, or you can revitalize it in any way that's going to fundamentally change the way that it does business. This is the nature of the Palestinian society that, by the way, has been incubated and cultivated for the past 75 years, not only by Palestinian leaders, but by the UN system and the international community that finances and perpetuates this system, right, to define themselves by the single-minded purpose of annihilating the Jewish state. That's it. I mean, they have no reason to do anything else because they're only incentivized by their leaders, by international donor community, by the international community of nations, and by the UN. They're only incentivized to maintain and perpetuate and continue to carry out forever their war against the Jews. I mean, if Israel is, God forbid, ever annihilated, the Palestinian people, such as they are, would disappear in a minute because the only reason they exist is to maintain their war against the Jews. That's it. They have no sort of positive ethos to being a Palestinian. It means something in the absence of a war against Israel. There is no such thing. So here we are talking about a people that exist for the sole purpose of annihilating the Jewish people, and they want to revitalize it. And that's the concept. That's a brilliant idea that everybody who's anybody in the international community has been pushing for the past 75 years, and they continue to do so today. They want a Palestinian state. They want a Palestinian state led by a Palestinian terrorist authority, and they're going to repackage it to a bunch of brain-dead, I don't know whom, journalists who like it no matter what they say, as revitalized, and we're all supposed to agree with it. And by the way, I mean, they're getting all of the Egyptians, after meeting with Kamala Harris, I read that Reuters report today saying that the Egyptian government wants a revitalized Palestinian authority to take over Gaza, and it's going to be led by technocrats. That's another buzzword that they like to use, technocrats, like people who know how to balance a checkbook are going to be trustworthy, and they're going to be any less dedicated to the annihilation of Israel than, you know, people wearing turbans with long beards and screaming Allahu Akbar. And why do you think that they don't do that too? Just that you're saying you're going to take out a terrorist with a suit and you're going to say, okay, he's a technocrat? I mean, we've had this. We had Mohammed Shtayyeh, the prime minister of the Palestinian Authority. He's a technocrat. He was brought in. He was living in Paris or in Norway in the 1990s. He was brought in as a technocrat to lead this Palestinian Authority that was supposed to be professional. And he calls for the annihilation of Israel, and he supports what Hamas did on October 7th. Right? Hassan Abu Libdeh was his sidekick. So Hassan Abu Libdeh was considered a professional demographer, and he carried out, just to be clear what a technocrat does, okay? He carried out the Palestinian population survey of 1997, right? And this survey inflated the number of Palestinians by 50%. Okay, they just out of thin air, he created 1 million Palestinians extra that didn't exist, right? And then he said, look, if Israel doesn't cough off Judea and Samaria and Gaza to the Palestinians, to the PLO, then they're going to cease to be a democracy. And on the basis of this falsified data, you have an entire political war that has been waged against Israel since 1997, claiming that Israel is an apartheid state, that we're in danger of losing our democracy if we don't give a state to a bunch of terrorists. So the technocrats are just terrorists in suits. They're just prosecuting their war against Israel, not through actually raping and slaughtering Jewish children and young women and men. No, they're doing it by putting out documents that are completely false in order to advance a form of political warfare whose goal is to delegitimize and demonize the existence of the state of Israel and promote the idea in the international community that Israel is illegitimate and has no right to exist. So that's what a technocratic government is. That's what the Americans now want. That's what the Egyptians are saying they want. And all the time, what are they doing? Blocking an actual settlement of this dispute because they don't want Israel to win. Because if the civilians of Gaza were relocated to the Sinai Peninsula, just, you know what, for like, they can winter there, you know? We can be done by the spring. If you get rid of the civilians, such as they are from Gaza, Israel would be able to defeat Hamas, annihilate their terrorist forces fairly quickly. By claiming that you cannot move under any circumstances the forced relocation of the Palestinians from Gaza or the West Bank, what you're saying is, no, we want them to stay there. We want to block Israel from winning. That's what they're saying. So they want these people to remain in their misery perpetually as refugees, the 17th generation after 1948, because they don't want peace. The whole industry here is about preventing peace, maintaining war, keeping Israel on the hot seat, always on defensive, never able to win, always saying that you oppose terrorism, but enabling it, facilitating, cultivating it, perpetuating it, and internalizing it. Because you yourselves have built up this concept of Palestinian nationalism that is predicated solely on the annihilation of Jewish nationalism and the Jewish nation state and the Jewish nation. So, you know, we have to think about this. What do we actually need? We need an Israeli victory. You know, they say, oh, well, what's your plan? What's your option? You know, I saw Martin Indyk, who always, you know, he's always carted out in the middle of a war to say that Israel is evil because he's a former U.S. ambassador and he always is able to figure out a way to blame the Jews. So now they want to put it all on Netanyahu. Netanyahu's problem, because he doesn't want the Palestinian Authority, which is a terrorist authority, again, to come in and control Gaza afterwards. And he says, well, what would Bibi have us do? Well, I think he would probably say what I'm saying, which is support an Israeli victory, replete with, right, the solution to the civilian crisis that you all are screaming about 24/7 by allowing these people to leave, by providing them with a safe haven somewhere else. There are plenty of countries to choose from just right here in the region without having to go to Europe, without having to go to America, without having to go to South America. just step up to the plate. If you care so much about peace, if you care so much about security for the people of Gaza, not to mention, God forbid, for the people of Israel, then the most important, most fundamental, and first thing that everybody should be doing is saying to the president of Egypt, Al-Sisi, who receives billions of dollars, by the way, from U.S. taxpayers every single year, hey, let them leave. Let them leave Gaza. Let them seek refuge somewhere else. If not with you in the Sinai Peninsula, then fine, somewhere else. Help them. But that's not what anybody is saying. Everybody is saying, Israel, don't you even think about winning. Don't you even think about taking any action. I don't know, personally, from where I'm sitting, this is just so appalling. I can't believe it. And it would be fantastic if the good people of the world would stand up and say, we all want to prevent civilian humanitarian disaster in Gaza. And the way to do it is to pressure Egypt to let the people of Gaza leave. Anyway, those are my thoughts for today. And I hope you enjoyed them, and I'll talk to you again later on this week. Take care.